that I support overall its economic approach. Some euro area members and the currency union as a whole were in an existential crisis. When the crisis erupted, we had neither appropriate tools to assess what had to be done in these countries, nor a specific institutional setup to cope with the unprecedented and unforeseen circumstances. In such a situation, the Troika approach, the cooperation between Commission, ECB and IMF, was established. For over a decade, I worked at the IMF, and therefore I'm familiar with the program design used by the IMF for over half a century. Their program design served as a model for the programs of euro area members. From that time, I know that granting temporary rescue loans to countries that have lost market access against strict conditionality works well if there is national ownership and full implementation. In my introduction, I will now concentrate on 3 topics before answering your questions. First, the economic adjustment in the program countries. Second, the topic of democratic legitimacy of the program decision and implementation. And third, the chances for program countries to return to a sound and sustainable economic, budgetary and financial situation. Skeptics of the current approach claim that the situation in the program countries would be very different and much better if only another approach had been chosen, if less austerity had been applied. I believe this criticism misses an essential point. The reality is that Greece, Ireland, Portugal and Cyprus faced 2 options when they took the decision to apply for an EFSF or ESM program. The option they chose was to ask for the solidarity of their euro partners, which means temporary loans at favorable interest rates and with long maturities. In that situation, these loans were the only source of financing for these countries because they had lost access to financial markets. Crucially, this option allowed the program countries to remain in the euro area. Polls show that this is what the overwhelming majority of the population in these countries want. In exchange for the rescue loans, the countries had to agree on country-specific macroeconomic reforms and fiscal consolidation in order to put their economies back on a sound footing, regain investor confidence, and eventually be able to finance themselves in the markets. For this to happen, painful economic adjustment was unavoidable. This adjustment put a heavy burden on many people. They saw their salaries or pensions reduced, public expenditures and social services cut, while unemployment rose. Understandably, this temporary hardship often results in anger and frustration in the population. These feelings make people receptive to suggestions that another, somehow painless way out of the crisis would have been available. But this other option is an illusion. The alternative to the current policies in the program countries would not have been painless, rather the contrary. In essence, the EFSF and ESM loans allow the program countries to buy time, to spread the necessary adjustment over a longer period. The alternative to the current policies would have been a disorderly default of the country, the collapse of the economy and the exit from monetary union, and in my view, that would have led to more hardship. Without our loans, the adjustment would have had to happen overnight. It would have been brutal. Governments would have had to reduce expenditures immediately to the level of revenue. History shows, and this includes the history of the IMF of the last half-century, that countries that go down that path not only inflict serious hardship upon their population, but also shut themselves out of the financial markets for long periods of time with negative consequences for economic developments. Let me turn to the question of democratic legitimacy. Some claim that the rescue programs impose economic, fiscal and social policies upon the program countries without political control, accountability and democratic legitimacy. I disagree with this view for the following reasons. The Troika gives advice. It does not take final political decisions. The political decisions are taken by democratically elected euro area governments. The Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU, that defines the conditionality under which the loans are granted, is discussed and decided in the group of Euro finance ministers, who all are part of elected governments. In most program countries, the national parliaments voted on the MOU, and they voted again on most of the implementing steps that needed to be taken subsequently. In some countries like Portugal and Ireland, even opposition parties at the time, which are today in government, were involved in discussing the programs. All EFSF and ESM programs were decided unanimously by all the euro area finance ministers. In about a third of the euro area countries, the finance minister could agree to the program only after his or her national parliament had given authority to do so. The political and democratic control via national euro area governments and parliaments, and not the European Parliament, reflects the fact that EFSF and ESM that the financing from EFSF and ESM is backed by national budgets of euro area member states, not backed by the EU or the EU budget. Member states opted for an intergovernmental approach to resolve the crisis. The creation of the temporary EFSF 2010 and the permanent ESM in 2012 as the first euro area institutions outside of the EU treaty is the direct result of that choice. This could be reconsidered in the future. I would like now to finish by pointing to the results of the programs. I am not minimizing the difficulties that program countries are facing. Unemployment is unacceptably high, especially among young people. But there are clear signs that the strategy is working. A few months ago, only few people would have believed that out of the 5 countries under EFSF and ESM program, 2, Ireland and Spain, would be able to have a clean exit. They did so last month, and both countries were very successful in issuing government bonds last week. But also in the 3 remaining countries under assistance, Portugal, Cyprus and Greece, cautious optimism is warranted. Last week, Portugal successfully issued a 5-year bond at reasonable interest rates. The program in Cyprus is very much on track. Even in Greece, where the starting point was certainly by far the most difficult one, is making progress. The country had a fiscal deficit of more than 15% in 2009. This year, the estimate is for 2%. Competitiveness is being regained in all countries. Exports are growing. Unemployment in the program countries stopped rising and is starting to decline. It is too early to claim victory, and reform efforts must continue. But I think that the progress so far should be acknowledged, and the national reform efforts in these countries should be applauded. These national efforts, together with better economic policy coordination at the European level, the actions of the ECB, the creation of EFSF and ESM, and the progress in building a banking union are making the euro area more resilient against potential future crises. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Indeed, Mr. Regling. Now we will have the debate under the usual rule of a 5-minute slot for question and answer by each member. We have a list of 17 members. If we have time enough afterwards, we will we'll go on with the debate with other members who are interested in intervene. So I will directly give the floor to Mr. Karas, co-rapporteur of the EPP.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Regling, first and foremost, thank you very much for being here. As far as I'm concerned, you're not here just representing an institution, but you're here as a key player with an exceptional amount of expertise in the matter. We have heard from people such as yourself who have been active in the IMF, in the Commission. Now you're active in the ESM, and you have really played the role of the cash machine within the Troika. Now perhaps you can explain to us exactly what the tasks were of the different institutions within the Troika. Why am I asking you that? Well, we're interested in the interaction between the different entities within the Troika and exactly how they interplayed with each other. We'd also like to hear the conclusions from your own personal perspective and not representing the institution, namely regarding what the answer is to getting an institution similar to the Troika, but one that can work in the interests of the European Union and on a sound legitimate footing. Now, the Troika was an emergency solution. It wasn't set up on the basis of European law, but you said that you saw there was no alternative at the time. How could an institution be set up on the footing of European law to do this job? Because if the International Monetary Fund is going to be brought in at the request of the Commission, then it would need sound European legislation to support that. And how would that look in the future? Now, you've said before that the Troika, if the problems are solved, will be simply dissolved. What's the alternative to a Troika? Could the ESM work in place of a Troika? Is there an alternative at all within the status quo, or could there only be an alternative with a changed setup for the future? Now, you said no access to the financial markets, but you can remain part of the European Union. What kind of scenario are we looking at here? If you're looking at the situation that member states found themselves in, could they have only negotiated with the IMF, or was this the only alternative they had? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Karas. Let me try to switch your questions around, and the last two were more backward-looking, and the others was more forward-looking. And also in my introduction, I focused on the backward-looking. I tried to make clear that economically I didn't see an alternative to the strategy of the Troika. But also institutionally, I think at the time it was not really feasible to do much else. It was a difficult situation. I said it, unprecedented. The crisis was something we had not anticipated, a crisis of this dimension. And I think the Troika was in the end needed. Initially, I also thought it could be handled by the Commission. But when it became clear that several countries needed support, then we needed also the expertise of the IMF and their money, because it's both which is needed, and I think that's also the question for the current situation. We still need the money from the IMF. At the same time, the IMF couldn't have handled it alone, because the amounts of financing that were needed for all the countries under EFSF program, so that's Ireland, Portugal and Greece, the IMF would not have been able to provide these amounts of money. The IMF has fairly strict rules how much money they can give, and what we have provided together with the IMF is far beyond what they could have done alone. They would have not been able to do it. There would have also been no majority in the IMF board to do it. So that's why, looking at the money needed, the volume of financing needed, that was one clear reason why we needed to combine European resources with IMF resources. And you may remember that initially the IMF committed 1/3 of the financing, European partners 2/3. Now that has shrunk to 10% from the IMF, 90% from EFSF or ESM. This is the case for the second Greek program and also for the ESM program for Cyprus. So the share of the IMF is getting smaller. They could have not done it alone. So looking into the future, so to wrap that up, I think this crisis we have made considerable progress. 2 countries have left already anyway. For the remaining 3 countries, I think it makes a lot of sense to continue with the existing approach. The IMF will also, they have money in the pipeline, continue to disperse to Greece, Portugal and Cyprus. Not a very big share, but still it's money that can be very useful. And they have been there from the beginning, so it would not be very efficient to now suggest to get rid of the IMF. Also, one should remember that all these countries, Greece, Cyprus, the others, they are members of the IMF. And like almost every country in the world is a member of the IMF. And when you are a member of the IMF, a country has obligations and rights. Part of the obligations is to help the IMF in financing their programs. But if a country gets into trouble, the country has the right to ask for an IMF program. So why should they give up this in favor of exclusively European support? That's looking more backwards than at the current situation. I think in the future, of course, one can consider several options. You mentioned some of them. It could be only the Commission. In theory, it could be the ESM. It could be, well, I guess those are the 2 options, probably no other. My view is that in the future, and this is for the next crisis, which will not happen the next few years, but in terms of decades, one day we will have another crisis. That's part of our economic system. By then, European institutions should have acquired enough expertise to do this. My preferred approach would be to use the expertise of the European Commission. I was Director General of DG ECFIN for 7 years. I know what they're able to do. I don't believe in duplication. I think we should have an efficient setup. So the ESM can play a financing role because we have demonstrated that we are able to issue bonds, generate funds which are needed to lend to countries. We also have special expertise on banks. For instance, in the Spanish banking restructuring program, we can work on those topics. But to negotiate conditionality, to monitor the situation in member states, to make forecasts on a regular basis, why should that be done by somebody else? The European Commission is doing a good job here. So that would be my preferred option for the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Reglin. On behalf of the Socialists, I give the floor to the co-rapporteur, Mr. Wanyok.
Merci, Pablo.
Thank you, Pablo. Director General, I would like to thank you very much indeed for agreeing to come to this hearing. For the Parliament, it is very important indeed, because as Mr. Karas has already said, we are doing a lot of research with this report, and we would like to see more cooperation in terms of future assistance mechanisms that will be set up in the European Union. And the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, is really the embryonic form of some form of perhaps European treasury in the future. You've been talking about what I would call Euro bonds, basically, and therefore this raises a question of democratic scrutiny of all of these various instruments. Article 12 of the EMS stipulates that there are certain conditions subject to provision of this assistance. And we do have a problem in this Parliament with what we're calling macroeconomic conditionality. And Article 12 also says that you give a mandate to the Commission to discuss these and negotiate these questions with the Member States in terms of conditionality and so on. And you may be aware of the fact that the Commission and the IMF are having a discussion at the moment about strategy. You said there was no alternative. But there was a discussion as to whether or not we should focus on fiscal consolidation, which was the Commission's position, or whether one should be concentrating on internal, domestic devaluation, that's reducing wages. That was the IMF's position. And of course, there was a total lack of transparency during these discussions, and there was no possible democratic scrutiny. They decided to focus on reducing wages and salaries with macroeconomic impacts which were hardly those desired, because growth is slow to come forward, and also there's been a huge increase in debt in all countries, far higher than before the EMS was brought in to assist. So I'm interested to know what your position is with regard to macroeconomic conditionality. Have you been consulted on this? Should we have had more structural reforms, or more fiscal reform, or fiscal consolidation? What would your recommendations be? My second question is about the future, really. If at some time I'm talking about your institution, your body, if it is called upon to take on greater powers and responsibilities, perhaps as a result of treaty changes, which we mention in our report, might one possibly think about a banking license be given to the EMS so that it could get financing directly from the European Central Bank? And this would underline the increased power of this instrument. Are there legal bases in the present treaties which would allow this to happen? And if not, how can we bring about such legal bases? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. In the beginning, you said the ESM could be the embryo of something much bigger in the future, like a European Treasury. That may be the case, but I think that goes far beyond the crisis, and in a way has nothing to do with the current crisis. I will keep an open mind on that, but this would require many, many steps. And if that were to happen, I think we would also be in an environment where the EU treaty would require substantial amendments. And then I would expect, if we are in that process, then also the ESM would be integrated into the EU treaty, making the ESM an EU institution. But on your more precise question on macroeconomic conditionality, in a very general sense, there is no alternative. I can only repeat that. Also looking at IMF programs, because the IMF is called in, and now in Europe the last 4 years, EFSF and ESM financing is needed when there is a real crisis. Something needs to adjust. We are not starting from zero in a nice, pleasant situation. We always start in a situation where the fundamentals have deteriorated. There are very significant internal, external macroeconomic imbalances, as the economists say. Financing has dried up in the markets. So the country is faced with very unpleasant choices. There are no pleasant choices left. And among the unpleasant choices, I mentioned them also in my introduction, in Europe, countries could have decided to leave the euro area. But according to the large majority of observers, that would have been more costly. So that's why, in the end, the 5 countries that received financing from us decided not to go that route, but to accept the conditionality that is attached to EFSF and ESM financing. And then the question, of course, is what is the right balance between fiscal adjustment and structural reforms? It cannot be either or, it has to be both. And when you look at the country programs for Greece, Portugal, all of them, and I'm sure you have done that, there's a reason why these MOUs are more than 100 pages long. What is said on the fiscal side doesn't need 100 pages. That can be relatively brief. It's the structural reforms that require a lot of space explaining in detail what is needed and what should be done. So it's a combination. Both is necessary. I think also there's a widespread misunderstanding that the Commission wanted more fiscal austerity than the IMF. This misperception comes from research papers of the IMF, where it was explained that, in their view, fiscal multipliers were larger than initially assumed. But there are important footnotes in this report, and the economic advisor of the IMF, Mr. Blanchard, has said very, very clearly and publicly that all this research, it may be true, but it still doesn't mean that a country like Greece should have had less fiscal consolidation. Because, and Greece is a clearest case here, when a country has a fiscal deficit of 15% of GDP, has lost market access, it doesn't matter how big the fiscal multiplier is, they have to do something on the fiscal side. And one more point on how much fiscal adjustment is appropriate and how much not, and this is something that I've not seen in any of your reports and also not in any of the responses from the institutions. The speed of fiscal adjustment has also something to do with the emergency financing that is made available by the partners. Because if the partners are willing to provide big amounts of financing for a long time, then the fiscal adjustment can be very slow. Because the slower the fiscal adjustment, the more external emergency financing is needed. But like in any IMF program, there are limits to the generosity of friends and partners, and therefore the speed of the fiscal adjustment has to be brought in line with the money that is available. And so it cannot go on forever. There has to be the fiscal adjustment, and the speed will depend on how much money the partners are willing to make available. So much on the macro conditionality. On the banking license for the ESM, I know this was discussed a lot 2 years ago when the ESM was under preparation, because the main reason for that at the time was that there was a fear that we would not be able to generate sufficient funds. That was really the problem, because the ESM treaty says clearly that the lending limit is 500 billion euro, whether we have a banking license or not. So it really only relates to our refinancing operations. My life would be a lot easier if I could get the money quasi-automatically from the ECB. I could close one half of the ESM that is in charge of issuing bills and bonds, but really relates only to that part. We have demonstrated the last few years that we are able to mobilize these funds, so the system, as it was initially foreseen, is working well. Our funding operations have not been a constraint on our lending capacity.
Thank you, Mr. Reglin. Now I will give the floor to the shadow rapporteurs of the rest of the groups, starting by Mr. Torvalds from ALDE.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Reglin, for being here. The day before yesterday, we listened to Olli Rehn. Yesterday, we listened to Jean-Paul Trichet. So we have actually rounded up the usual suspects, and whether you like it or not, you are one of them. What we see now around Europe is something which is very fragmented. The Troika was partly fragmented in its views on the crisis and on the remedies. The program countries are very different. The banking sector is very fragmented. The impact of the policies on the countries are fragmented, and the political landscape seems to be fragmented. So how do you see your part in this fragmented world? Is it a patchwork, or in a Europe which is still lacking an industrial policy for the moment, or is it something which you really believe is going to stabilize it, at least to some extent? Now that's the first question. Now we see some kind of rebound. Is this a sustainable rebound, or is it just something which is also going to be fragmented? So congratulations to your job. I'm curious to listen to your answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for appreciating the work of the ESM. It's not over. We know it's very important, I think. I think your description is unfortunately right. There's a lot of fragmentation. Looking at countries, looking at financial markets, the banking sector in particular. But I think lots of our efforts, and ESM only plays a small part in this. You also play a part in that as far as banking union is concerned, and the Council and the Commission. A lot of the work of all these different institutions is, I think, geared towards reducing this fragmentation and ideally eliminating it. It will be a slow process. But looking at what has happened so far in the real economy, I'm not pessimistic, because the two countries that exited their programs in December, they are already success stories. That's certainly how the markets look at them. The interest rates today are 1/3 in the 10-year segment of where they were 2 years ago. They are again able to finance themselves. And it's not only what financial markets think, because we know financial markets are very volatile, there's herd behavior, and you cannot rely on them. It's only one indicator. But the countries also implemented real structural reforms. In Spain, the last 18 months in particular, there have been significant structural reforms in the labor market, pension system, raising retirement age. Things happened very quickly, which is possible in a crisis, that had been under discussion for years and years and did not happen. And looking at Spain again, I take note of reports coming from bank analysts that say in the medium term, and let's say in 4 or 5 years, Spain will become the economic powerhouse of Europe. I'm only quoting not only one bank. Morgan Stanley has been saying this for a year already, and many others have now followed, that Spain will become the economic powerhouse of Europe. And I think they are really creating the basis for that. Of course, Greece is not in such a situation at the moment. They are not at the end of their program. Portugal is somewhere in between. Ireland will also do well. So in the real economy, I think the fact that these countries are under conditionality, and the 5 countries that have borrowed from us and have been under conditionality, they are the reform champions in Europe. You also see that in OECD statistics, where even Greece gets very good marks. The OECD puts out one report where they classify all the OECD member states, which go from Korea to Mexico and all the European countries, and they say Greece has put in place more reforms than any other country in the OECD. Of course, coming from a very low base, they had a lot of catching up to do. But if this continues and is not interrupted, it's unavoidable that this will lead to more growth and jobs. It's just unavoidable. It has happened in any country around the world that implemented tough reforms, which are very unpopular and painful at the time. But if they are successfully concluded, these reforms, it will lead to more growth. Let me mention one other example from the IMF. You may know from the world economy, countries like Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Brazil, they have been the best performing country in the world economy during the last 10 years. All of them went through very serious crises. Indonesia, Korea in the Asian crisis, 97, 98, Turkey in 1999, 2000, Latin America a bit earlier. And when they were in the middle of the crisis, the population also thought there was no light at the end of the tunnel, no hope. Markets also thought for a while, this is desperate, let's get out of here. But then, during the crisis, with IMF money and conditionality, they created the basis for more growth and jobs in the future. And that's what we saw. The problem is that you see the benefits of this only a few years later. So often the governments that implemented these tough reforms have been voted out of office by then, but for the countries, for the economies, it's good. You have the same sequence of events in all the countries that went through crisis, and there are lots of them in the last 50 years. We have this now in Europe, and the 5 countries that are going through this crisis, that implement reforms, if they continue to do it, I have no doubt they will be in a very good position in 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So that's the real economy. On financial markets, let me not be too long here, all the efforts that are being undertaken under the heading of banking union are done to get rid of that fragmentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Reglin. As you can imagine, I personally appreciate your words about Spain, but I would like to highlight also that Spain is out of the scope of this report. Now, on behalf of ECR, Mr. Epping.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a very short question. Mr. Reglin, welcome here. In the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung of June 14 last year, you said, and I quote, "The IMF is showing above all that it does not understand the rules of our single currency bloc," unquote. Can you explain what exactly the IMF did not understand? What impact did the IMF's failure to understand the rules of the Eurozone have on the Troika interventions in the programme countries? And generally, can you shed some light on this special relationship, or sometimes a bumpy relationship, between the IMF on the one hand and its European counterparts on the other? Thank you.
Yes, you quoted, or the Frankfurt Allgemeine quoted me correctly. It doesn't always happen, but this one is correct. This was a very specific question and a very specific answer on an IMF report. You may remember they put out a report assessing their own work on Greece. And in this report, they criticized the Commission for focusing too much on rules. And I thought that had to be commented upon, because in my view, monetary union cannot work without rules. It's a rules-based system. So if somebody criticizes that the Commission, which is the guardian of the treaty and the guardian of these rules, if the IMF criticizes that, that is for me an indication that they are missing something. So that was the background to that. It was one comment on a very special report, which was done by an outside office, not by the real actors in the IMF. They make these assessments from time to time on difficult programs. So those who really are sitting in the Troika for the IMF were not the authors of this report. So it's a bit dubious what its status really is. But the report became very prominent in that week, and therefore, when I was asked, I made this sharp comment. And I remember exactly why I did it, and I have no regrets on that. As you probably heard the last few days, in the Troika there are sometimes disagreements. I am not there, let me repeat that. My staff is in the countries from time to time, and the Troika is there because we have to be ready immediately when the negotiations end, so we need to be involved to understand how much money will be needed and when, what are the financing conditions, the maturities and all that, because we then provide that financing part of the program. But we are not actively participating in the negotiation of conditionality. Of course, as I said, we follow closely. We have, of course, a very clear interest that the programs succeed. The three institutions sometimes have disagreed, but this is not surprising. I know it from my IMF work. When a mission goes to a country and there are 6 IMF economists, they also can disagree on the best approach. Everybody is bringing his or her expertise and trying to use it for the best of the country. All follow the same objective, to help the country bring it back to a sustainable situation so that they can grow again, create employment and access markets. So there's no disagreement on that. But otherwise, I think it shouldn't surprise anybody that economists do disagree. And then they have to discuss it and come to an agreement. And that has happened in every case.
Thank you, Mr. Reglin. On behalf of the Greens, Mr. Philip Lambert.
Yes, herzlich willkommen, Herr Regling. You mentioned democratic accountability, everything is in Ordnung. I wouldn't agree with that. Well, formally you're right. But I mean, you know that these MOUs, as you said, are more than 100 pages big, and they are negotiated between civil servants. On the end of the receiving country, probably there's more direct political involvement, but when it gets to the table of the Eurogroup finance ministers, well, it gets approved without any discussion. The point is that the mandate that is given to the Troika, as far as I know, is very broad, not precise at all. And when the results come, no one questions them, which means that actually political choices are being made at staff level without real, I'm not speaking of formal, but without real democratic accountability. And there's a known example in Greece when an effort of 325 million that was proposed by the Greek government as being made in the defense sector was forced by the EU Commission to be made in the pension sector. And that's a political decision. I mean, regardless of the rights and wrongs of which choice, I mean, that's a political choice that never got any mandate and never got any real political legitimation except that rubber stamping by ministers who are not looking at that. So I would take exception with your statement that we're in Ordnung in terms of democratic accountability. Now, you've mentioned success stories. I mean, I find it a bit, how should I say, shocking when you know the state of poverty, of unemployment, of income and growing income inequality in these countries. I wouldn't call Ireland or Spain a success story with 2/3 of youth unemployment in Spain. So if success is measured by the trust of financial markets, and as you said, well, they can be wrong, and they often are, well, then, of course, it's probably a limited definition of success, and the amount of reforms, fine. But I think that the economy serves well-being and not just ticking boxes in reform plans. Now, my question is on this. Of course, if they had defaulted, all of them, one way or another, that would have created immense chaos and suffering. Totally agree with you. There's no way out of this situation without suffering. The question is, who suffers? I mean, are those who behaved irresponsibly the ones paying for it? And just let me take the Irish case. Well, the creditors who lent irresponsibly came out okay, whereas the borrowers who borrowed irresponsibly ended up paying the bill, plus all the Irish population. And in that sense, I'm really asking myself, and with your IMF experience, had they defaulted, of course it would not have eliminated the suffering, but would have been the balance of attribution of pain more just, and refer to the Icelandic case. Just a tiny question on decision process in the ESM. When it gets to issue the loan, do you review the conditionality, or do you just take the agreement of the Eurogroup as good enough and you do not reopen the box? And that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. Mr. Reglin.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Lambert. On accountability, the way you describe it is not correct. You cannot say that the ministers are only rubber stamping the agreement. I'm sitting in every Eurogroup the last 4 years.
That's Jean-Claude Juncker saying it. Huh? He chairs those meetings. Well, he used to chair those meetings.
He is in the Eurogroup. He was in the Eurogroup. But that's not my memory. I'm there. I'm also in the meetings of the deputy ministers that prepare the Eurogroup. You cannot expect that ministers read the 120 pages in every detail, so their deputies prepared. But then this is discussed in detail in the Eurogroup. There's a reason why important meetings of the Eurogroup where a program is finally accepted often last till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. If they only rubber stamp, it could be over in an hour. So it cannot be rubber stamping. And that on the side of the Eurogroup and the creditors. On the side of the borrowing countries, of course, also when the IMF goes to Korea or Turkey, they negotiate mainly with civil servants, but in the end they negotiate with the finance minister and the central bank governor. Again, not every detail that has been done before, but all the critical issues come up then at the political level, and that's the same here with the European countries. Then the finance ministers in every case has to go to the cabinet, where of course every minister looks at his area, his or her area, to see how they are affected. In all cases except Portugal, the parliaments adopted the MOU. In Portugal it didn't happen, but because it was just before the election, but the Troika talked with both parties, the parties that was in government before the election and the opposition that then took over the government afterwards. And subsequently, the parliaments, of course, have to implement most of the measures that are mentioned in the MOU. This cannot be done by decree. A few things, yes, but most of the items cannot be done by decree. So I think your description of what has happened is, I don't share that view. And therefore, I'm not saying everything is fine and everything is perfect, but there is democratic control on both sides, from the creditor countries and from the borrowing countries. Then you're right, we cannot measure success only by access to financial markets. I didn't want to say that, but it's the first step. And that's also what experience tells us. And I did not only talk in my introduction about the success that Spain, Ireland, and also Portugal last week had in financial markets. I also talked about growth that's coming back. All countries will have growth this year. Some of them had quarterly growth already in 2013, like Spain. Even Greece, all forecasters say will have positive growth in 2014. Unemployment stopped rising. Exports are growing in all these countries. That's one reason why the current account deficits, which were excessive, have been eliminated. But there is a pain. I made that very clear. I agree with you. One should be careful on how to define a success. But important, I think, is to see the sequence. And from my ESM perspective, of course, the financing aspect is a very important one, because if countries regain market access, which is the first objective of the program, then we can stop financing. And that's positive. But of course, the program should be designed, and in my view, they are designed with the ultimate objective of returning to growth and creating jobs again. But again, the pain for the population was huge. You're also right that not all those who behaved impossibly suffer. It's not always fair. You can apply that to many aspects of programs. We know that people with very high incomes are very mobile and have much easier ways to move out of the country and escape taxation. That's a common problem, unfortunately, that I've also seen in many IMF programs. Was often discussed during the Asian crisis, during the Latin American crisis, that the rich people could escape. Others cannot escape, so they are taxed, and their taxes go up. So that's one common feature of unfairness in adjustment programs. Nobody likes that, but it happens. You pointed to another one, that indeed in some cases the creditors did not suffer, and therefore the debtors suffered more. That's true, particularly in the case of Ireland. I think our instruments have been developed since. And in the future, it's not yet fully in place, the BRRD, You are involved in that. You have different views from the Council. I still hope that there will be an agreement before you move towards election, because it will be important. But it's important that there's an agreement. The Council decided in December. Now you have to bring it together. But then there will be a new instrument that did not exist 2, 3, 4 years ago. And I think that's a very useful, good step for the next crisis, unfortunately. Your last question, ESM, we do not review conditionality. We understand it, we are there, I'm in the Eurogroup, but the Eurogroup takes it, not rubber stamps it, they look at it, they take it, they decide, and once the Eurogroup decides, it's our role to provide the financing.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Breglin. On behalf of the GUE, I will give the floor to Mr. Jürgen Klute. I will appreciate that we are running a little bit out of time, and we are giving you a lot of time to answer. If you could focus to 5 minutes or close to 5 minutes, I will appreciate it. Mr. Klute.
Danke.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Mr. Regling. Firstly, thank you for agreeing to attend this discussion. I know that at the moment the ESM is an intergovernmental setup and not directly responsible to the European Parliament. I nonetheless acknowledge the fact that you're here and can answer our questions. I was on the delegation to Portugal and to Cyprus, and I'd like to perhaps draw your attention to a few comments and observations I made at the time. Essentially, there are two things that occurred to me. In both countries, Portugal and Cyprus, and I'm sure it applies to the other countries that we will be visiting soon, there is a massive issue with liquidity. There's a massive problem for small and medium-sized companies to get liquidity. They can only get it at very high rates of interest. That's a big burden on them. That has a knock-on effect on economic development. It impedes the creation of new jobs, and it stops people becoming economically active. That's the first point. Secondly, in Cyprus, there are social policy consequences of the programme. What we heard from our interlocutors was the fact that the less developed social security systems in the country, if you compare them, for example, to Germany, meant that people had to organise their own healthcare provision, their old age provision, care for their children and so on. They were having to do these things for themselves. And unfortunately, if you have the money, you can do it. If you don't, you simply can't. And the people who don't have that prosperity were simply seeing their finances crumble. And that has huge social consequences. We spoke to people who were not under the 100% deposit guarantee for their savings in the bank, and they'd simply lost everything. They were forced to build up these savings in order to provide for their old age retirement and so on, and they've simply lost their pensions as a result. Now, these aspects, and this is my first question, were they not taken into account? Were they not considered when the programmes were being prepared and when the measures were being set out? The second question is that there aren't just economic and social consequences of these issues, but there's also an issue regarding the way in which people agree to or accept the existence of the European Union. Now, given that, could we perhaps look to a way of correcting the programmes with a view to improving the social acceptance of these programmes? People realise that they're being overly and disproportionately affected by the measures being taken, and as such the acceptance of the programmes is declining. Now, what our Cypriot interlocutors said to us was that they felt that their concerns were not really being taken into account, particularly if you look at the haircut, the potential haircut, and the possible ramifications that might have for the country. They felt that there was a potential domino effect on the country that wasn't being taken into account. I'd be interested to hear, was that taken into account? How did the decision that was taken get taken? What was taken into consideration? Also, we didn't hear anyone saying in the country that we didn't need reforms. Everyone agreed practically that reforms were required. However, they didn't feel that the situation in the country was being considered properly with regard to those reforms. Also, the reforms in the countries, was it all intended to ensure and stabilise the euro? And if so, should it not have been European level decisions taken to try to strengthen and stabilise the euro? Something like the banking union that we're now discussing. Should work have been done at European level to stabilise the euro? Because my question is, all of the focus that we had on the programme countries, is that not sort of taking your eye off the ball with regard to the reforms that need to be carried out in the other countries in Europe in order to bring things into line? And would it not be worthwhile focusing more attention on the work that needs to be done at European level? I think there are underlying errors that were responsible for the crisis that could have been corrected.
And the 5-minute slot, yeah. You're right, the other members use, but I would appreciate Mr. Reglin to answer the quicker, the better. Thank you.
I would try to be quick, but these were good questions, so it's not easy to be too fast. On your first one, liquidity problems in these countries are huge, so your observation is absolutely correct. And it has something to do with the crisis, of course, particularly in Cyprus, where the banks are very much part of the crisis, so they are not able to provide liquidity. Portugal has never had a big banking problem. So here we get to the fragmentation in financial markets, and everything we are doing with the banking union is trying to address that. It will take a while, but it is a problem. Then we have special programs at the European Investment Bank, for instance, to help SMEs in particular. It is an issue, and it's recognized. Your second one, bail-in in Cyprus. This was an absolutely novelty. It was new because the dimension of the problem was even bigger than in the other countries. It could not be solved without bail-in because on the one hand, the European partners were not prepared to give that much extra money, or if they had been prepared to do that, then the debt in terms of GDP would have reached a totally unsustainable level. So those options were just not available. Bail-in became unavoidable, but it was the first time. It was before we are developing now the new systems in the context of BRRD. And therefore, there are certainly some unintended consequences. We were aware that there are these social issues, but maybe not all of them we were fully aware, because it had to happen quickly. Because of Cyprus. Cyprus delayed this for a long time. And Cyprus, the biggest delay was that Russia was prepared to give them cheap money, 2.5 billion euro. And that delayed the adjustment because this was money without conditionality. For me, that's unfortunately a very good example that financing without conditionality can be very bad for a country. Financing with conditionality helps over time. So the social consequences, they are known. To make corrections now means somebody has to come up with more money. And I don't see that. Somebody in Northern Europe or the IMF, I don't think they are prepared. But that would be the consequence, as I tried to say earlier already. Whenever you relax the adjustment efforts, the financing need goes up. So somebody has to be prepared to fill that gap. The link with the Greek developments was very obvious, was clear to everybody in the Eurogroup and for all the acting persons. We knew exactly, and we had the numbers, how Cypriot banks had been affected by the Greek haircuts. So that was well known, and it added to the burden in Cyprus, that's correct. But it was known, that was your question. Then your last two questions were whether we shouldn't focus on other things, not only on the reform efforts in the countries, but also on the broader European reform agenda. I think until very recently now we are moving out of the crisis. It's not over, but we are moving out. So it's less acute, but a year or two ago we had no choice. I think we had to set priorities, and the priority was to make sure that the euro area stays intact, that countries get help against conditionality, make the necessary reforms, and can stay in the euro area. I think that was correctly the priority number one. Because if this had not happened, if the EFSF had not been created 3 years ago, I think Ireland, Portugal, Greece would no longer be in the euro area, and Europe would be a different place today. So I think the priority was the right one, but you're also right that people have only so much energy and so much time. It meant that there was not much time left to look at the other things which are also important. I think I better not get in, because of time constraints, whether we need a social union to make monetary union work. I'm not convinced of that. But one should think about the development of Europe. That I'm very much in favor. I think we do need a treaty change one day. And as we move out of the crisis, we will have again more energy for that.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Reglin, on behalf of EFD, I give the floor to the Shadow Rapporteur, Mr. Belder.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Director Reglin, it is as a simple historian, myself, I'm a simple historian. It is a pleasure to listen to your clear and nuanced presentation. Let me now hasten to my question. The European Stability Mechanism was intended to help Eurozone countries in difficulties, but more and more it appears that it might be used for cleaning up banks' balance sheets with bad loans. According to the ECOFIN last December, the European Stability Mechanism will provide for bridge financing during the transitional phase of the development of a common backstop. My question, would it not be better if writing off bad loans would start much earlier instead of continuing with providing banks with cheap money? It is questionable if the loans will be paid back. And my second question, doesn't that bear the risk of direct financing of banks which are insolvent? And my last question, do you share my concern about that and about the involvement of your fund in this process? Thank you very much.
Sorry, can you repeat your third question? I didn't get them.
Do you share my concern about that, the financing of banks that which are insolvent, and about the involvement of your fund in this process?
Okay.
Yes?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's all about banks. I think you're right. There is a tendency to see whether ESM money is also needed to clean up the banking system. Of course, from the beginning, the ESM was allowed to do what we did in Spain, to give a loan to a country, and then the money is earmarked to restructure the banking system. So that was always there. But now we have discussed the possible new instrument of direct bank recapitalization, which, by the way, would not go to insolvent banks. Insolvent banks would be closed. This instrument would only be used for solvent banks if they have a shortfall in capital. And if this instrument is ever used, which requires a unanimous decision, the Eurogroup said there will be a cap of 60 billion euro. So out of our total lending capacity of 500 billion euro, of which 450 billion is still available, this would be a maximum of 60. And all this would only happen in the future in line with the BRRD, depending on what you agree with the Council, after substantial bail-in has happened. So that, I think, is the main answer to your question. In the future, there will be bail-in. I think you are discussing details, but bail-in will always happen. And if the main provision in the BRRD is also agreed with you in the European Parliament, this says 8% of liabilities have to be bailed in before public money can be made available. We looked at the experience of the last 3-4 years, and only very few banks would have needed more help after this bail-in, if this bail-in had happened. So I think the 60 billion would go a long way, would be more than enough, and would have been more than enough in the past. So with BRRD, the situation really changes completely, and therefore I don't see that the ESM will need a lot of money, be it as a backstop or for direct bank recap for banks in the future, because bail-in changes the landscape.
Thank you. And finally, the last shadow rapporteur, Dr. Martin.
Well, thank you very much. I do assume, and it's understandable, that you would be not against describing you as an intergovernmentalist. But I just want to reinforce that most likely the majority here in this House is actually very convinced that for the sake of all these programs and new setups, it would be crucial to have at least more insight from the side of the European Parliament, but also possibilities to control these. Having said this, I would have 3 questions, actually clarifications from your side. With your background with the IMF, could you explain to us, hopefully a last time, but it will be very difficult to communicate with the voters, that whatever was in the papers of the IMF that was then attributed to Christine Lagarde, as far as a levy tax is concerned on all incomes or whatever, on deposits in banks, that European citizens have in no way to be afraid of such an overnight cap on their interests, or would you say this could happen? So this was number 1. 2 is, in brief, your opinion on the Liikanen report, actually on what is now in the pipeline, where we only read the papers about it for the moment, the new proposal from Michel Barnier's side on the restructuring of the banking sector, so the split up of investment banks and the private sector. And the third question is, do you see any possibility, or would you even like it, take into account what country you're from? I'm from Austria. It will also cause troubles in my country. That in order to solve the too big to fail problem, we would actually have to reduce so-called big banks to a size that they cannot cause systemic risk within any of the nation states where they have their headquarters in. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This takes us a little bit out of the crisis situation. Let me first assure you I'm not an intergovernmentalist. I've been all my life very much convinced of the community method, and I'm a strong believer that the European Commission must play a key role in European integration. And I've been telling this, for instance, to my Asian friends all the time, who, when they ask me about advice, how they should engineer their Asian integration on certain parts of Asia. I know this text on deposits, which appeared in one of the IMF papers. I think this is a total non-starter. The IMF is in no position to impose it anywhere. If they wanted to, I'm not sure they really want to. It can only happen by governments. I don't believe our governments are prepared to do that. And there's also no need. This could have been an alternative in Cyprus to part of the bail-in. You may remember that the first attempt to come to a package on Cyprus included some of these elements. It was rejected by the Cypriot parliament and by public opinion. Maybe it would have been a bit easier for the Cypriot economy than the second package, but it was rejected. But that was the only case where I could see that something of this sort could have been appropriate. Because of the magnitude of the problem and the financing required. I don't see any other country in Europe with similar problems. Liikanen report, I don't think we can get too much into that. I think it is a good report. It overlaps to some extent with the Volcker report and similar reports in the UK. Implementation is not easy because the principles to differentiate is quite good, but then where to draw exactly the line, I think one has to admit that this requires a lot of work and can make it very, very difficult. And part of that is a too big to fail problem. I don't think one needs to necessarily cut banks in half or in several parts. I think one response, and that's being applied, and not only in Europe, but on a worldwide basis through decisions by the Basel Committee and the Financial Stability Board, is to have more capital for big banks. I mean, all banks will have more capital faster in the future, but the big banks and the systemically important banks will have a surcharge on top of that. That provides an extra cushion. And also the living wills, which are required in the future from systemically important banks, which basically means a plan how to have a resolution of a bank in case of crisis, will also help to deal with this problem. So I don't think it's only a question of cutting into pieces.
Just a brief remark. As a non-member of a party, we stuck within the time limits.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I give the floor to Mrs. Podimata from the Socialists.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, President, for being here. I agree with what you said, that setting up troikas was unavoidable in the first stage when the crisis occurred. I agree much less when you say that troikas make suggestions and that they don't impose solutions. I think that this is not entirely true, because if you are with a gun in your head, as you know, practically you don't have any alternative than accepting what you are told to. And this is not good for the ownership of the programs, a key factor, as you very rightly pointed out. But as you know, the ownership is not something that can be imposed. It is something that has to be achieved through citizens' trust. And now coming to Greece, I fully agree with what you said, that the period of fiscal adjustment, fiscal consolidation, is related with the amount of money that your lenders are willing to give. Nevertheless, I believe that with the experience that we do have today, it is quite worthy and very much in the spirit of this inquiry report of the Parliament to be able to reassess what we have decided, what has been decided 3.5 years ago. That means a very short period of fiscal adjustment without any discussion on debt restructuring, despite the fact that the problems of the country, of Greece, were mainly of a structural nature, as you very rightly pointed out. I just would like to focus on where do we stand today. You pointed out that despite the fact that Greece started at a much lower point than the other countries, which is true, it has achieved an unprecedented fiscal adjustment and has implemented more structural reforms than any other country, according also to the OECD. And then you said, stick to that and this will lead to growth and jobs. And that doesn't sound enough to me. So my first question is, what needs to be done more? And I believe that this is where our partners can be more supportive, a part of the implementation of the program, in order to boost growth and jobs, with 27% of unemployment and 6 years of course, less deep recession, but still recession. This is the first question. And the second one, you made a lot of references on the positive sides in the markets, the fact that Ireland regained market access. You mentioned the bond issued by Portugal, 5-year bond with a reasonable interest rate. And then coming again back to Greece, Greece, as you know, is also willing to try to regain access in the markets during, hopefully, 2014, encouraged by the primary surplus of nearly 1 billion that we have achieved already this year, a year earlier than predicted. But in order to regain markets' confidence, we have to resolve the question of the sustainability of the debt. And I know, we all know that this is a discussion for April, but still, Mr. President, I would like to know What, according to you, would be the most appropriate way to achieve debt sustainability, which is a key factor in order to regain markets' confidence? Thank you very much.
That's a very difficult question, Lars. We may need to extend by an hour here. But it is also an important question. I'm not denying that at all. But again, the way you describe the Troika work, I cannot agree. Sorry. They do not impose solutions. And I give you two examples. You know, has had now 3 instances where the Constitutional Court declared unconstitutional certain adjustment measures. So the Portuguese government then, after a few days or weeks, proposed new measures. And the Troika never objected to that. So they do not impose just one set of measures. They are looking at the targets, the objective. Often it's the fiscal, the reduction in the fiscal deficit, but it's really up to the country to decide how to go there. And it's not imposed. Of course, if not more money is available, and you recognize this link, this relationship, then one has to find a way to bring the deficit to a smaller level. But how to do it, it's really up to the country. This is also the IMF approach. Another example is Ireland, where a few months after the program started in 2011, there was an election. The opposition took over, and they said they didn't like some of the measures adopted. But they also promised to stick to the fiscal targets. But how to get there, they made adjustments, and the Troika agreed with that. So this is different from imposing every measure. Okay. Then you said Greece had a short period of time for fiscal adjustment. A lot happened in 4 years, going from 15 to 2%. I talked about it already in the introduction, and I always recognize that as a major effort. But it was so high, it had to also happen reasonably quickly. And you said with no debt reductions, this is not true. Private creditors, yes, 2 years later. It was a difficult process. We never thought that in a country, in a monetary union, we would need this kind of approach, that private creditors have to give up more than half of their claims. This should be something that only happens in poor developing countries. It became unavoidable. It happened, and it helped Greek debt sustainability. What else needs to happen to generate growth? Of course, the program itself is very important, but you're right, it's not enough. There are many other things that should happen, can happen. You know, the Commission is trying with its own task force in Athens. The EIB is trying. The government should try whatever is possible, and partners, I think, are willing to help with technical assistance. The program focuses on the core of the financing issue, closing financing gaps in a way that is not detrimental to medium-term growth. Debt sustainability, of course, is important to regain market access. I think in Greece we have a very special situation, and the debate is complicated because it's different from the normal IMF experience. Because the IMF looks at debt sustainability within 10 years. That's when they want to get their money out. So that's, from their perspective, in other countries, a reasonable approach. I'm not criticizing that. And also, they argue that if 10 years from now there's no debt sustainability, private creditors will not come in. But in Europe, particularly with Greece, we have created a different system. We provide loans to Greece from the EFSF for 30 years, with interest rates that are only half as high as the IMF. And we have had an interest rate deferral for the first 10 years. So Greece has, for 10 years, no debt service payments to us. There's no burden on the budget, no burden on the economy. It all happens much later than in a typical IMF program. And therefore, the fact that the debt to GDP ratio is 120, 127% 10 years from now is not very meaningful. It doesn't say very much. One has to look at the burden for the budget, for the economy, and there's no budgetary burden coming from EFSF claims. That happens 25, 30 years from now. And private investors who are considering moving into Greece will not think at the moment about going there for more than 10 years. They will go for a shorter period. So for them, it's key that there is no debt burden the next 10 years, debt service burden coming from our claims, and EFSF claims are 2/3 of our public debt now in Greece.
Thank you, Mr. Regli. Now I give the floor to Mr. Bullmann.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Regling.
Mr. Regling, well, at the outset, let us point out what we're not disagreeing on or we're not arguing about. I mean, I think here we have a general consensus here in this House. Now, your statement about the ESM, that if we didn't have the ESM, we would be living in a different place and definitely not in the Eurozone, I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Now, you're right. And we'll be saying this as loud as we can, both of us, in the coming weeks and months. Now, the other point I cannot fault is the fact that there have to be adjustment programs and there has to be conditionality. There have to be conditions in these countries under the programs. But there is a question as to which processes, which adjustments, conditions must be imposed. Now, on the content of conditionality, I understood what you meant and I heard what you said, but can we not just focus on your expertise, but can we perhaps understand the actual mechanics of the way in which the Troika works? Who says that there's no policy choice, or who decides which policy choice is to be adopted? You could say, for example, investments in solar energy, wind energy, and so on are the right strategy for future energy possibilities. Or you can say the opposite. I mean, the same thing would apply to inflation rates. If one country is living beyond its means, then where do you cut? Where do you put extra taxes and levies? And all this is part of the process. But what we want to understand is who takes the decisions. As a fund, do you make a proposal, or does the proposal come from the Commission, or are the creditors making proposals, or does it come from the people who have to implement these programs? Now, this is a black box as far as we're concerned, so that's my first question. Secondly, you talked about a rosy future, and I'd love to believe that. But I have a question about the future of the actual institutions themselves. And you know more about this than we do, of course. The ESM as an instrument of community method. How could this be useful as compared to what it can't do yet, whereby we could develop some sphere of action and to strengthen the economies of the European countries?
Mr. Regling.
Yes. There are policy choices. That's very clear. In each program, in the programs we have seen in Europe, in every IMF program, there are choices within the framework of the financing available and therefore the adjustment required, which particularly boils down to the fiscal adjustment, because if not enough money is there, or depending on how much money is there, there's a certain speed in the fiscal adjustment that's unavoidable. But then within that fiscal adjustment, there are policy choices. You now mention investment in renewable energy, that preferably one shouldn't cut back. Other colleagues of yours have said one shouldn't cut back on social security, but somewhere one has to cut. And these are difficult policy choices, which in the end the borrowing country has to take. The Troika, I know it from the IMF, and it's an IMF program somewhere in the world, and I know it from the Troika and the European countries. They make proposals. And they also give advice and say certain cuts are more growth-friendly than others.
Who is doing the proposals in the Troika system?
All institutions that are involved. Not the ESM, but the three institutions that are part of the Troika. And you know the ECB has a somewhat lower ranking or reduced role because they advise, it's said explicitly. So Commission and IMF takes the lead, but ECB has, particularly in areas of financial market, banking, good experience. So they give advice mainly in those areas, but also on fiscal adjustment because they follow that in countries. But these are proposals. It has to add up in the end. That's always the constraint. One cannot say we don't want to cut here, we don't want to cut there, we don't want to raise taxes. If there's a fiscal deficit of 15% of GDP, something has to give. And there I can assure you that the people who are sitting there negotiating with the borrowing country, first with the civil servants, then with the Minister of Finance and with the Cabinet, they have only the objective to help the country. They have no hidden agenda. But the policy choices are very difficult and they have to be taken. I don't know whether that probably doesn't answer everything, but it's like that. And every country is different and the policy choices in every country are different because the problems are different in every country. So there is not one recipe for all countries. The IMF has often been accused to have one approach for everyone, and it's not true. I have been in some of these negotiations in African countries and Asian countries, and it's tailored to the country. The IMF makes proposals. In Europe, it's the Troika. The country must get the ownership because what you said earlier is absolutely recognized that many programs fail because ownership is not there. And the IMF knows this perfectly well because they have the experience. So they try to get the ownership. And ownership can only be obtained when the government buys in. And it's often relatively easy to have the finance minister buy in because the finance minister is the first member of the cabinet who understands this link between the amount of financing available, the need to reduce the deficit. Other cabinet ministers are trying to protect their turf. This is normal, and one should expect that. But then the finance minister has to convince his colleagues, and he needs the prime minister for that. This is a normal process for these kind of programs because programs from the IMF worldwide, our programs in Europe, they interfere massively with policy making in the country. People who are involved know that. And we know it only works when there's ownership. So to the largest extent possible, one wants them to buy in, and therefore choices are offered from the Troika to the government. But the constraints need to be observed. It has to add up in the end. On the future of the ESM, also not an easy question. As I said, I can envisage, and I said it already when I was here a few months ago, to inform you about what EFSF and ESM are doing. I think when there is a more comprehensive treaty change, it would seem logical to integrate the ESM into the treaty. That in itself will not change the role of the ESM as we know it today. But if one wants to have a treaty change and have a further move towards fiscal union, then there might be other tasks that have to be handled either at the euro area level or the EU level. And then one could foresee possibilities for the ESM. But that would be an additional step. To make it a community institution as a first step does not broaden our mandate or our importance. But there are possibilities in the future. But it will take a while.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Sánchez Presedo.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Mr. Regling. Thank you very much for giving us the fruits of your experience. We do appreciate the contribution you're making to the ESM and the ESM's contribution to providing financial stability. Now, I think to a large extent we managed to avoid an implosion within the European Union and we managed to avoid a catastrophic outcome. However, that's a long way from saying we can sound the all clear and we can say this is now a success story. Of course, we know that if we don't continue to give support to the Eurozone, the situation will not resolve itself, and that's why we're looking at how the ESM can achieve better results. The adjustment variables and the employment rates have to be improved. We know that at current rates the adjustment criteria and the debt ratio are simply not sustainable, and things will have to be improved. And in the absence of a community perspective and a European-led economic and monetary policy, we won't get a long way. But I've got a couple of questions. Firstly, in terms of interest, the European Financial Stability Facility was something that wasn't easy to set up in the beginning. Greece was suffering from liquidity problems, but it was very difficult to convince everybody that this was not going to be sustainable. The first measures that were set out then had to be adjusted to what was going on. Secondly, the countries that joined the programme, Ireland and Spain, which have then left, Spain, for example, set out 2013 as the date to get back to balanced books. We're now looking actually at 2027 to actually get back to a level footing. And it seems that we have a systemic problem that needs to be followed up in order to ensure the balance of payments on a sound footing. My question is, what measures have been looked at to try to ensure the proper follow-up of payments in order to make sure the situation resolves itself? Also, we have a framework in which to act through the Banking Resolution and Recovery Directive. We've got a number of documents of legislation to work on, but what are we looking at creating in the future? What could we create to improve things in the future? Again, the community method is important. The role of the Parliament is important, but what role will the ESM play in performing the functions that we need to perform in the future? Could you perhaps be more precise as to what kind of tasks you would like to see the ESM performing in the future?
I think your last question is a bit related to the first one, when you asked what kind of proper follow-up system is being created from the EFSF and ESM side. We are creating something we call early warning system, and we are not only calling it that way, it's also mentioned in the ESM treaty. And this early warning system is designed to make sure that we will be repaid. So we will be in contact with the borrowing countries long after the last disbursement has happened, because our loans to Portugal and Ireland run for 22 years. In the case of Greece, it's 30 years. So it's a long period of time. So we will monitor the budgetary developments, economic developments, to have certainty that we are being repaid in order to protect our shareholders, which are all the euro area countries. So we are setting up the system. Of course, we work together with the European Commission, which, as I explained earlier, has the expertise, is monitoring these countries anyway, and we don't want to overlap and do double work. But we have a special perspective because we want to make sure that the repayment obligations are honored. The BRRD, we already talked about it briefly. I think it will improve the situation, certainly in cases when banking problems lead to a crisis, because the bail-in, which is the main new feature of the BRRD, will be substantial, and that will reduce substantially the need for public resources, be they from the national budget or from the ESM. What else for the ESM in the future? Even if there are no new country programs, and that's certainly my baseline scenario, my central scenario, we will have still a few disbursements to do for Portugal and Cyprus in the context of the current program, also for Greece. As you all know, there may be a third program for Greece necessary. We will see. If it's necessary, it will certainly be substantially smaller than the first two. So in any case, we still have some disbursement to do. Then we have to manage our outstanding claims, which is a particular task on our liability side, because our lending is for 20 to 30 years, while the average maturity on our liability side, so the bonds we issue, is only 6 years. We do issue bonds with a maturity from 1 to 25 years, and the average maturity is 6 years, which means we need to continue to roll over for the next 25 years and be in the market, issue bonds to refinance the existing loans. At the same time, we are investing the 80 billion in paid-in capital, which member states have paid into the ESM. So that's another major task that we have to fulfill. Of course, very conservatively, this money is there to protect bondholders. It's crucial for our good rating, so we cannot make any losses, but it needs to be done. So we are busy with these activities, and then, as discussed with Mr. Bullmann, more things may happen, but only in the longer-term future.
Thank you. And I finally give the floor to Mrs. Costello from Ireland.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Regling, for your presentation here today. I'm from Ireland, and as you know, Ireland has just recently exited the bailout, but we would say that we exited the bailout despite austerity rather than because of it. I think you would also be aware too that the Irish situation is quite different because of the extent of the banking crisis that we have in Ireland. Before the crisis, our debt ratio was about 25%, and then during the crisis and currently our debt ratio is running at 120%, and over 30% of that can be accredited to the banking debt that we have. Now, at the time that the government went for the bailout as well, the Irish government didn't have the option of a bail-in, and indeed even subsequent efforts to try and bail in senior bondholders, particularly unsecured senior bondholders, were met with fierce resistance from the ECB, and indeed we tried to question Mr. Trichet on this yesterday in relation to his role in threatening the Irish government. It's alleged that he said that a bomb would go off and that bomb wouldn't be in Frankfurt, it would be in Dublin. If Ireland did in any way try to bail in or burn the senior bondholders. So, as you were aware too, in June 2012 there was a really important decision made in terms of breaking the link between sovereign debt and banking debt, and it was viewed at that stage that Ireland was a special case and that there was agreement that there would be a facility for recapitalisation of two of the solvent Irish banks, AIB and Bank of Ireland. And that has subsequently been the subject of much discourse. But I'd just like to ask you, would you support the Irish call for direct recapitalisation of those two banks, which are solvent, and to say that Ireland is a different case, since it didn't have the opportunities that are available now, that it should be considered for some direct recapitalisation of the banks?
Yes, you're right that certain instruments that we are developing now, particularly the BRRD, and it's still not in place, but we are now actively working on it, were not available 3 years ago. That's correct, and if it were, certain things could have been done differently. You're also right to say that in June 2012 there was a general commitment to break the link between banks and sovereigns, but there's no consensus to do this retroactively. The Eurogroup has said this could happen in exceptional circumstances, but as you know, it requires a unanimous decision, and I don't see that consensus to be there. At the same time, I think one should keep in mind that Ireland has received particular benefits from the ECB. Benefits is not the right word, particular generous refinancing of certain government bonds which were issued in the context of the bank restructuring. So that already goes some way in breaking the link between banks and sovereigns, because without that operation the burden on the budget would have been bigger. Also the fact that the maturity of EFSF loans for Ireland was extended a few months ago from 15 to 22 years at the very low interest rates that we do charge, means an extra relief for the Irish budget. And I'm not sure it would have happened without the other considerations that you referred to. So there are benefits given. Whether more can happen, I don't know. That's the political decision of the Eurogroup, and it requires consensus.
But it would also require your support, and would you be willing to indicate your support for such a move?
Well, I can only repeat what I said, that there has been special consideration being given to Ireland through maturities, from the ECB, that we had a different situation. But it doesn't help what I think. We need a consensus in the Eurogroup, and I see that there's great reluctance to use this new instrument in a retroactive way.
Mr. Reglin, unless you have something else to add, we end here this dialogue. Thank you very much, especially to Mr. Reglin. I think it's been a very fruitful debate, and thank you very much indeed to my colleagues for his interventions. Thanks to all.